Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 4 of Encounters Debunked, Truth or Myth. Today we're going to be looking at some, 4 supposedly true park ranger stories. Now again, I promised I would try and keep this every Sunday, so I'm trying to do my best to adhere to that schedule, but producing daily content can really take a lot out of you as far as scheduling goes. So just keep expecting new episodes every Sunday. And folks, episode 1 of the Eyewitness Encounters podcast is coming out this Saturday. Yes, it's basically where I call up an eyewitness, talk to them, they recount their stories to me, I ask them questions, we have good dialogue. It's wonderful to hear. Episode 1 is already filmed from one of my own subscribers. His nickname is Deadpool, but goes by the name of Dylan. Again, that'll be out this Saturday. I'm really excited for you guys all to hear it. I think it'll be really cool. If you know anybody that you would think would be a good fit for the show, please send them my way. This is to anybody else out there too. If you've had any sort of strange experience, whether it be paranormal, cryptid, demonic, really anything that would fall into this category, please reach out to me. Tell me your stories. I'm always looking for cool people to put on the show and interview, and I would like this to be a long-lasting series because I really enjoy doing it. So again, you can email me at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Kindly just drop a comment below and let me know you got some really cool encounters to share with me. I would love to interview you and share those encounters with the whole world. So let's get on to the actual episode. I used to be a park ranger when I was a bit younger. I did it for quite a while, from 95 to 2004, and then I had a career switch. During my time as a ranger, I had moved around a couple times to different locations all around the great Northwest. My job was pretty normal on a day-to-day basis, but I've had a couple of dozen strange experiences that I can't really explain. There were also several incidents that I was told I was not allowed to discuss or ever talk about. You'd be amazed at the stuff other park rangers and the people up above know about that civilians have no clue. The particular instances I'm going to be telling you about is how on numerous occasions I had found these so-called abandoned staircases just out in the middle of nowhere. Okay, so on the topic of park rangers, that usually falls into the search and rescue personnel, as well as other miscellaneous medical and government workers that would be involved in finding missing persons, or just Department of Wildlife. I mean, I can go on. Now, I'm not quite sure what it is, but there seems to be, I don't even want to say a conspiracy, but it's almost like, there's a lot of people that are coming out and talking about the whole staircase thing. I understand many people think the whole staircase thing is a creepypasta, and that people like David Paulides has written it off. And I mean, there are a couple other circumstances where people are made to believe that these things, are supposed to be just a hoax. In my opinion, I honestly think David Paulides might have been told to write off the staircase thing, because it seems really weird that you're saying, I mean, the staircase situation is not the first time I've heard about it in these stories. When I heard about it from David Paulides, it wasn't the first time I've heard it. In the new search and rescue series that I've been reading, I think I'm on part 3 now on this channel, there's a lot of staircase situations in that, and they talk about staircases. I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong. It's possible I'm wrong, but I just find it weird. It's weird to me that these things are found just in the middle of the forest. It's weird to me that, these are supposedly portals that go to different places and whatnot. And again, there's just a huge mystery surrounding them, and I don't think it'll be probably more and more years down the road until we get a little bit more closure on them. Again, I've heard of people finding them and talking about them, and just, yeah, the other theory I've heard too is that they're just leftover stairs from maybe a burnt down house or a building, but these are literally being found in the middle of nowhere and brand new, clean. Again, just listen to one of the search and rescue story parts that I tell, and they talk about it more in there, how they'll be pristine and clean, and how, they're basically told to never go up them or to never go around them. And, when you do go around them, there's like a weird magnetic energy and things feel weird, and it is really strange. It's a bizarre phenomenon, and I'm really not quite sure myself if it falls under false or it could be truth. It's very possible it could all be made up, but I've heard several other park ranger recounts of people talking about staircases. I mean, it's kind of a more well talked about thing. I'm sure many of you who clicked on this episode, who are listening to this, have heard it before too. So again, it's just an interesting thing. So I'm probably going to lean on the true side. I would like it to be true. It's terrifying. The first one I ran across, I had probably been a ranger for a few years already. So I'm thinking it was 97, 98, or something like that. It was still wet and cool, so I'm thinking early spring. My job then was surveying, and where I was at the time was pretty far out in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking a good 20 plus miles from any roads or civilization. I had come to a clearing where in this smaller pasture was this Gothic style spiral staircase. I was so weirded out by this. I decided to inspect further, and I discovered that it was actually fairly new. It hadn't been weathered down yet. There was even red carpet that lined each step that looked fairly new too. What I don't understand is, why would walking to the very top do anything for anybody? It literally led nowhere. Why would someone bring one of these out here in the middle of nowhere? But again, guys, it's got all the staircase stuff you'd expect to hear. It's pretty much out in the middle of nowhere really close to a road. I mean, miles just out in the middle of the forest. No reason to ever have had a structure there before. Again, usually not weathered down at all, looking very pristine, like it was just put there. And, they've talked about seeing metal stairs, wooden stairs, stone stairs, all varying styles from new to Gothic to old to everything. The second time I encountered one of these would have been the following year in the summertime. I was in northern Washington at the time, deep in one of the national forests, and in the middle of the forest was another staircase. This one looked older and was made of stone. I would guesstimate that it was probably 10 to 12 steps tall, where it looked like it just dropped off into nothing. The third time I ran into one of these things was the year that I quit, 2004. I was actually with my supervisor at the time, and when we both saw it, my supervisor was pretty quick to have us move on and continue doing our job. He seemed nervous. His demeanor was strange, like he knew something. He told me not to mention it to anyone or my other coworkers. I thought the entire thing was bizarre, but I just took his word for it and wrote it off. Alright, now to remind you guys, since I read so many stories, I have not heard this story since I posted it, which was almost 2 months ago. So now that I'm listening back to it, I'm remembering a lot of these details and just things that I thought of when reading it at the time. And it's amazing how many details, they're getting on, just because, even as I'm reading through the search and rescue series that I'm doing, just so many of these details line up with these stories. It's crazy. The whole supervisor thing and the fact that they want to keep things really hush-hush about the staircase situation. They don't want anyone to know. They're acting like it's a danger. It's really bizarre, and it makes me wonder, what do they know? What have they been told, and why are they being told to keep quiet? What are these things? They obviously know about them, and they know that they're dangerous, since they're told to tell people to keep quiet, and to threaten, for people to lose their jobs over it, or to be sued. It must be something pretty serious that I'm almost wondering what they do in situations where, you have those lone hikers who go out and they hike 20, 30 plus miles into the wilderness. What do they do when they run across one? Do these individuals go up these stairs? Do they get hurt when a park ranger finds them? What do they do? So I don't know. It's a really creepy situation. Years and years later, I got curious about some of the things I had seen and experienced during my time as a ranger, and I looked it up. I guess it's a much more common occurrence than I thought, and many other ranger and Forest Service peoples have seen these staircases all over the country. What the hell are they used for? Are these portals that come in and out of this world? I generally don't believe in all of this nonsense, but I don't know what to even think anymore. How? Tell me, how do you explain these hundreds of staircases just left in the middle of these forests? It makes no sense to me. Once again, guys, we're matching up all the details in the story with about everything else we've heard, especially from the search and rescue stories. Again, how everything matches up, it's quite frightening. And again, if this is all false, it's very well done and compiled, since there's multiple stories that give the exact same descriptions. If they are true, which I believe they're true, then clearly there's something going on. So, with that said, let's move to story 2. I was assigned to an area in southern Idaho for a while back in the 80s as a park ranger. During my tenure as a ranger, I had a lot of Bigfoot encounters you would never believe. It just so happened that the area I was in was a very active area. I've had encounters with these beings up close, aggressive, and calm. There was one time I must have gotten too close to one of their dens because I heard a lot of screams, howls, and whoops, and had actual pieces of logs thrown in my direction. Had I not moved out of the way, I would have been a goner, taken out by one of these logs. Now, this is really cool and a little bit unconventional. So a lot of park rangers are more, about strange occurrences, missing 411, that kind of stuff. There is talk of Bigfoot sometimes, but when you have stories like this that, tell about a park ranger in an area that happens to be working in an area where there's a really high activity amount of a specific cryptid, but I guess in this case, Bigfoot, it always becomes really interesting. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of encounters that talk about Bigfoot from a park ranger perspective, because they're the ones that usually kind of have the more run-ins with these things, like you get the ones that see families, you get the ones that get the really aggressive Bigfoots, you get the ones that see usually multiple Bigfoots. And actually, as soon as I started listening to this encounter again, I remember it. This is the one where he, I believe, encounters a family of Bigfoot. And as well as, like he just said, in the story, getting logs thrown at him and coming into Bigfoot property, or Bigfoot territory, I should say. I think you're finally starting to see more park rangers and search and rescue personnel coming forward with the things that have happened to them, no matter how strange or paranormal or fake it may seem. I feel like a lot of these people, they want to get their stories out. And, this is terrifying. These people, they go to these states and these areas and these forests, and they have these encounters with these things that everyone's told that don't exist. And, and then they're told to keep quiet, or they get transferred, or they lose their job, or they get sued, or something happens. And then on top of that, if you try to tell anybody in public, you're kind of ridiculed because everyone thinks you're crazy, or you're high, or you're drunk, or something happened, or you're crazy. And it's the amount of conditioning that the human psyche endures just from a society and a cultural perspective, especially in our world, is just, like we're literally controlled what to believe in this sense, because I can't imagine being in this position where you have these insane encounters with these beings, but who do you talk to about this? What do you who do you even go to? So I feel like it's a lot to digest, and I know there are many individuals who go out hiking, just everyday individuals that have these same encounters, but some of the park ranger ones, man, they're pretty intense. I mean, you're out there in the thicket, like that's where you are, and so you're not just going to have, see one standing off in the distance, or, maybe step into its territory. You're going to get the meat and potatoes of Bigfoot. And again, the small amount of encounters that I've read with park rangers and search and rescue that actually deal with finding Bigfoot and running into Bigfoot and encountering Bigfoot, they're all pretty frightening and unfortunately a little too up close and personal. I think that's just the nature of the job. So, yeah. There were multiple times at night that I would hear all sorts of wood knocking and the likes. Whooping was a common sound to hear around at night and even during the day. There was another time I had seen a whole family of Bigfoot traveling from one ravine to the other side. I'm assuming the alpha male, because of how large he was with the female and 2 little ones. This male was pushing 12 feet easily. I mean, this thing was humongous, built like a bulldozer of a body. The female was quite smaller. I would say 8 feet, and I could see what looked to be breasts hanging from her chest. The little ones kind of reminded me of chimpanzees. Very lanky looking, but very odd looking as well. They even acted like children. Misbehaved, wanted to wander and not follow their parents' direction. Wow, guys, so the details are, again, just chilling because of how accurate they are and that match other descriptions, multiple other descriptions of many other encounters that I've talked about, especially encounters that, deal with encountering families. There's usually an always alpha male or a larger male from what they see, and a female who's generally shorter, roughly around 5 to 7 feet. I think that's kind of the average. And when they talk about children Bigfoot, or when they talk about seeing kid Bigfoots, that's usually pretty interesting too. I've heard people talk about juvenile Bigfoots, in the case of where it's literally like a Bigfoot but only 5 to 6 feet tall, but still has all the same features. That would just tell me, again, it's probably a juvenile Bigfoot who hasn't fully grown yet. Or they talk about the small ones, which are kind of more chimpanzee-like, lengthier limbs like arms and legs, act very childish, which, again, this story already has all the qualities picked out. There's actually a video, and I can't remember what it was called, but some of you might know it, and I think it's on YouTube, where it shows a mama Bigfoot and what looks like a baby Bigfoot, and the baby Bigfoot is very chimpanzee-like and is like swinging through the trees. But it's clearly not a chimpanzee, but it's kind of monkey-like behavior, and then it like jumps back on the mom. And so it, to me, looks like a real legit Bigfoot footage, and just the way it acts. And from what I've gathered, Bigfoot are a type of people. They're not a wild animal. They're extremely intelligent from everything I've gathered. So, to live in a family unit like that, and to have a pack and to have territory and are just signs of a very intelligent being. And so, traveling in a family setting more than just a pack, and the behaviors that are attributed to like the females and the males and even the children are just really fascinating. And especially, again, from a park ranger or search and rescue personnel who's going to be able to see these up close and have longer duration-wise encounters and more frequent encounters. It kind of looked like they got scolded at some points, but I'll never know for sure. One of my scariest experiences was when I had heard what sounded to be a bunch of ruckus and noise in the woods, and trees rattling and shaking. It was howling and screaming. After having the other Bigfoot experiences, which I never told anyone about, I just kept it to myself. I figured these sounds were 2 Bigfoot fighting each other. I must have been right, because a little while after, the sound had died down. I went to go investigate the area to find out what had gone on, and I stumbled upon a Bigfoot corpse. Okay, so this is so far my only really biff with the story. I'm assuming from the way he talks about it in the story that at this point, when he had heard these supposed 2 Bigfoots going off on each other, that he had already had run-ins and encounters both verbally and physically with other Bigfoots, because maybe it's just the way he's writing the encounter down, but to me he sounds like he's really sure of himself. Like he heard this huge loud ruckus and was just like automatically, oh, yep, that's a Bigfoot, it's 2 Bigfoots fighting. And to know that, oh, well, I better go look around, maybe there's a corpse, and yep, that's a Bigfoot corpse. just seems a little weird to me. So I think it could either be two things. Either A, he's full of shit, or two, maybe he just has a terrible way of expressing the knowledge that he had through written communication. I'm not quite sure. It was mangled, beaten, and pretty bloody. I didn't get too close to the thing, but from 30 feet away, I could tell this huge black hairy mass had to have been a dead Bigfoot. I knew then that the sounds I was hearing was this thing fighting with something. I didn't get close and inspect it in detail, but I saw fair amounts of blood. I decided to leave the area and contact my immediate supervisor. Okay, so he does elaborate on the story a little bit more and talk about hearing the ruckus, seeing the corpse. I mean, I guess in this day and age, if you were to see a corpse like that, you can only guess it was a Bigfoot. But I don't feel like he should outright say, well, it was a Bigfoot fighting another Bigfoot. Because even though he might be right, I don't know, it's just when you have stories like this that are just so, they almost come off as like blatantly written, as if like that's absolute truth. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't anything in his language that was similar to, oh, I heard these weird sounds and then I was fearful and I wanted to go investigate. It was automatically a Bigfoot, and I know it for sure. And I don't know, I could be reading too much into it, but that's just what I think. It's just weird to me, coming off from someone who has read hundreds if not thousands of encounters. Just oddly strange. The very next day, I was removed from the area and stationed in a different state entirely. I remember the phone call I got shortly after I told my boss. I was basically told by his boss that I was scheduled to be stationed elsewhere because they didn't need my services in that spot anymore. It was still the strangest call to this day that I've ever gotten. It was so out of place, and I feel there was something more to it than just a rescheduling of sorts. Alright, so even though his story ends with him talking about how, he went to his supervisor, and basically his supervisor sounds like he didn't want him to blab about what he had seen. It's just yet another conspiracy-like issue that's really strange. Removed him from the area, obviously, because he probably saw it and knew too much. I'm not falsifying this guy's story. I'm not saying he's full of it. There's just kind of that part of the encounter that I didn't really 100% believe in the way he wrote it. But he does talk really accurately about the description of Bigfoot families, the behavior, there being an alpha male, even down to the description of the female. There's been many cases where people have reported seeing, female Bigfoots based on seeing breasts, and even families of Bigfoot, seeing the chimpanzee-like children, or seeing just the younger juvenile Bigfoots that look like a Bigfoot but are like 5-6 feet tall. So I want you guys to walk away from this specific story as in, like, yes, there's truth in the way he described things, but just keep note that the way someone could come off in a story, again, it may just because he's not good at writing it down, but it came off as, I don't want to say fake, but so overly arrogant and so sure of himself that it was almost like that portion of the encounter was like a fictional story. So if you're out there listening to this, the person who wrote that to me, you really need to work on writing your stories down. This actually took place back in the 80s, way back before I was park ranging and doing that stuff. I used to guide in Idaho, specifically the Chamberlain Basin. Back then, we would go in there for weeks at a time, on horseback, and I would guide hunters in. This basin is miles and miles of woods, and the wilderness is thick. I'll never forget the one time that I encountered a strange old man in my adventures. On one of my guide tours, we were probably a few miles in at this point, and getting ready to set up camp, when we came across an old shack. My first initial thoughts were that it was an old abandoned hunting shack used long ago. As we approached it a little closer, our horses started acting nervous and wanting to go in the other direction of the shack. I thought that was weird, so I tried to steer my horse on course, and we were successful, but as we were passing the shack, the door opened up, and this old man stepped out. All of us, including me and the hunters I was with, couldn't believe it. This old man, who had to be at least 70, looked pretty feral and had zero trace of humanity left in his face. You could just see it on him. He wore it. He was filthy, wearing just a loincloth. The disturbing part was his attire besides the loincloth. He wore on his head a stag's skull, adorned with weird trinkets and gems, much like you would see the natives have, or witch doctory, I guess. He also had what looked to be human skulls made into a large necklace that he wore around his neck. Alright, the weird thing about this story is he talks about the human skulls, which I'll get to that in a minute, but to me, I want to say it's possibly valid, but it's not totally against the possibility of existence of finding, somebody out in the middle of nowhere who's literally become feral and has lived on their own, and also who happens to be practicing witchcraft, which might explain the feeling why the horses were kind of freaking out. Maybe he's practicing some voodoo kind of stuff, and there's like weird vibes, and there's demons around the area or something. I don't know. That's my educated guess for, the horses freaking out, just because when there's witchcraft that's being practiced, it brings in those vibes and those spirits. So I'm really not surprised that, they felt weird things. But, my guess is that it was just a hermit who happened to live out in the middle of nowhere, again, practicing witchcraft. About the skull thing, though, I'm not too sure how this individual would be able to wear human skulls around his neck unless he shrunk them or did something to them. But that's the only part that I'm going to call bullshit on, because there's no way you'd be able to have multiple human skulls, especially with the size they are, maybe unless they're children, around this person's neck, or maybe if it was like a giant necklace that was adorned with like 3 or 4 skulls, but the person doesn't go into detail, so I don't really know what that looks like. He appeared to have some sort of wooden wand-like object in his hand that also had a rotted-looking human skull. He glared at us for a few seconds, watching us closely, examining and calculating every move we made. Muttering something to himself, he ran back inside. It happened so fast, none of us said anything to him. After we were a little ways away from the shack, we were pretty convinced amongst ourselves that that was indeed human skulls, and we believed he could have possibly murdered people out here. It made us pretty uneasy, but the further we traveled away from him, the more we forgot about that crazy old man. We ended up setting up camp just a few hours later. When we ended up crashing out, and all of us were asleep, I awoke to the sound of rustling around our campsite. It sounded like a person, and it was getting closer, and then I heard more rustling. Before I could even think, I heard a gunshot and a scream, and then what sounded like someone running away. What I think is implied here is that witch doctor, what I can only assume, was a witch doctor, followed these people however many hours that they traversed to their camp, stalked them, and maybe wanted to kill one of the individual men for a sacrifice, who knows what. But that's my only guess, and maybe one of the individuals was armed with a gun and saw that this person was trying to get into their tent, fired at him, and the individual ran away. If he was hit by a bullet in any way, there would have been a blood trail. If the individual had missed this other individual, then it's possible that this supposed witch doctor could have just gotten away in time. So I'm not really sure. I quickly jumped up and got out of my tent. I saw one of the other hunters standing there with his pistol, his tent torn up and him looking at me, pale-faced. He told me he was awoken when he saw a dagger plunge into his tent and tear downwards. He pulled out his pistol and fired, not knowing if he hit the person trying to get into the tent or not. Whoever it was ran off. I couldn't help but think of that crazy old witch doctor looking man that we had seen earlier, and he had come out of the shack looking at us. But I didn't want to say anything. The horses were pretty shaken up. Me and the other hunters were shaken up too. But we prevailed on to the next day and didn't end up encountering anything else strange again for the rest of the trip. Okay, so here he divulges that yes, someone indeed tried to stab this individual or who knows what they were trying to do, but they were trying to obviously get in this person's tent. He fired a shot in which I have no idea how he missed a person, but he somehow did. This person obviously ran away. You know, if it's this supposed witch doctor who's trying to get him inside the tent and he's able to run away, I don't know. It's just this story is kind of in the middle for me. It seems a little far-fetched. Why would this individual follow these people out here for 3+ hours? The more I think about it, the more I'm just going to lean on the false side overall. I never did tell the police about what I had seen. I figured it was just some witch doctor hermit who had murdered those who had come by. He had several human skulls around his neck, and one on his wand-like object, like I said previously. I don't know how he got them, and I'm glad we didn't find out. I just remember getting bad feelings when we went by a shack that first time. I knew from the get-go something wasn't right. I guess I shouldn't be surprised it was probably him who tried to attack one of the hunters I was guiding. So I'm not going to sit here and say that what happened or supposedly was recounted in the story is true, but to be honest, I'm going to have to probably lean false for me personally. I really don't believe this story as much. It's possible that there could be witch doctor hermits that live out there, but in the nature of the story and how the events happened and the way things were described, and I personally would just go along with that. This was probably a fabricated story, and I mean, it sounds interesting, and it could very well be true, but to me, I think it's the skulls in the necklace, and he just happened to have a shack, and I don't know, there's just quite a few things that ring a bell. I think it might be more the writing style than it might be the actual story, but just when you hear certain details like the ones in this story described, I don't know, it just kind of comes off as false to me. Let's move on to the next one. Not me, but my brother, who is a bit older than I am, is a park ranger and has always had some rather interesting accounts out in the wilderness. When your occupation involves being deep in the woods for days at a time, I guess you're bound to see all sorts of stuff. Now, my brother can't reveal too much information for fear of him losing his job, or even worse. He tells me in this instance he was working in South Carolina, checking out several parts of the wilderness for something he wouldn't tell me about. He says he was hand-picked to work on this special project that would be used for different means. One project he worked on was an expansion project in which he had to travel deep into the woods and survey different parts to see what areas would be best for expansion. I'm not too keen on the details, but whatever. I just know in this time he was out in the Francis Marion National Forest. What he told me next deeply disturbed him and I. He said he reached a part in the woods where things got really quiet. He said the hair on the back of his neck was standing straight up, and he started getting nauseous, but had no idea what was causing this. He then started getting this fear, this raw, primal fear. He had to continue doing his job and reach the GPS coordinates he was sent. Things went on like this for around another 15 minutes, he said. The forest was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. He said he was extremely uneasy and thought about backing out. He said the next area he walked into was the icing on the cake. Before he entered this clearing with trees, he started to smell a really bad odor of rotting meat. He started hearing the loud buzzing of flies. As he approached the clearing nearby was when he saw it. There were at least a dozen of them, if not more, from fawns to does, even a few bucks. Skinned, mutilated, ripped open, all forms and varieties of mutilation hanging up in the branches of trees. There was so much, my brother told me this grisly scene looked like it was something out of the movie Predator. He went into great detail because my brother stood there in horror, taking it all in before leaving and failing to reach his given coordinates. I know I let quite a bit of the story play before I would put my own commentary in, but this is a story that actually kind of freaked me out when I read it, and I very well remember the story. The Predator-like connection is eerie, of course, just because of the descriptions of how these deer were killed and skinned and mutilated. It sounds like something, obviously, maybe a Bigfoot, I don't know what, killed these doe and bucks and just threw them up in the branches. And why some of them are mutilated different than others, I'm not too sure. It would make sense if, maybe some of them were skinned, but I'm not sure. Obviously, there's no reason any hunter or person would have any reason. In fact, I don't even think it would be possible for a person to get a deer 30 feet plus up in the tree, and there's no reason to. Unless you're hanging it to dress the deer, but even then, there's no reason you would hang it that high, and you wouldn't just leave a deer mutilated like that, nor would you leave several, in one area, mutilated, ripped open, partially skinned, etc. So I don't know, this is one of the stories that to me kind of freaked me out, because I'm like, man, could it have been Bigfoot? What could it be? But, we know it's got some of the key factors. It's out, of course, in the middle of nowhere, always. And this poor guy just happens to stumble upon it. And so, who knows? I mean, I can't even imagine all the stuff that goes on in the forest when we're not around, or, stuff that goes on in the middle of the nowhere, kind of like staircases. He said a few of the deer that were strung up in the trees, which were high up in the trees, mind you, 30 plus feet up in the air, were only partially skinned and mangled. Some of the deer had their guts partially ripped out and hanging, while others, limbs and heads, were completely torn off their bodies. Not cut, not surgically clean cut, torn, as if some madman had ripped it off with its hands. He said the smell of blood and rotting meat was so overpowering, he began vomiting profusely before retreating. He didn't even want to think about how all those deer got put up there. Who or what even did it? I asked him if he thought it was a person that did it, or a hunter for whatever reason, and my brother just told me he had no idea why anyone, especially a hunter, would hang any deer 30 to 50 feet up in a tree, mutilate them, and leave their guts hanging and partially skinned. Yeah, exactly. Again, there's no reason anybody of any kind of hunting would ever do this. This is obviously beyond the realm of strength and ability of any human, so that kind of puts it into the realm of paranormal, mysterious, cryptid. So there's definitely something going on. I'm not sure if it's like a mass government operation, but, we never know. I definitely think it could be Bigfoot related. It could have anything to do with missing 411. I'm not too sure. But it's obviously a strange occurrence, and the way he describes it, man, he's kind of freaked out. I would definitely say this one leans more towards the truth side. I believe it's true. There's nothing that really stood out as extremely fabricated, to me at least. It seems pretty genuine. He had genuine intent to get where he needed to go. The story makes sense. It's just my question is why and what would be the reason for mutilating all these deer, ripping them open, tearing off limbs, disemboweling? It's very, very strange, and I've never really quite read encounters or people finding things like that. Why? They weren't gutted. These were mutilated in different ways. He tells me no person would be able to do something like that, especially not with their hands. He reminded me that these deer weren't cut, they were torn apart. When he had to report back to his boss about what happened, they actually did not believe him. He got in a lot of trouble for it, but he still refuses to go back there and deal with what he did. Alright, so we end these 4 stories with obviously someone who had a very genuine experience, not necessarily with a cryptid, but an experience of running into a lot of dead deer mutilated in horrible ways, hung up in trees. I feel like that would really freak anybody out, and your first thought would go to the movie Predator. Again, I believe that this is a true story because it scares the hell out of me. I'm thinking it definitely falls in the cryptid realm, possibly Bigfoot. I don't know. I've never heard of Bigfoot doing this to their kills or hanging stuff up. I don't know if maybe they were curing the bodies. I don't know if maybe the Bigfoot was possibly storing the food back. I'm not sure. Who knows? This is one of those encounters where it's just like so terrifying. There's so many open ends it could be, and this poor guy obviously got scolded by his superiors and didn't sound like he lost his job, but I'm sure he got written up for it. So yeah, I'm going to say that this is a true story and that the majority of these that I get sent again are true. At least I think so. There are a few that are false here and there, but I feel like they're far and few between. Like, especially listening back, I feel like I have a different perspective on things. Because as I'm like, when I get the stories and I read through them, even if they seem far-fetched, in my mind, I'm like, oh, this might be a good read. This might be entertaining. Whereas, like, now that I'm, like, listening back with a critical ear, I'm really able to dissect the details from just a true or false perspective and be like, okay, well, this clearly is, in my opinion, fabricated. Where there's some stories that are blatantly true and are, well, at least that are written well enough that they can come off as blatantly true. So it's interesting that you have that duality of different stories that you get. And so, like I said in my other podcast, I try and give you guys a good variety of stories. I try to always aim for true stories. I really do. But sometimes, I like to throw in a couple fabricated ones into the mix because it makes for good reads. But again, I feel like if I keep them 9 out of 10 true purposefully, then it kind of makes a good mix. But anyway, all right, guys, so we're going to go ahead and end week 4's episode of Encounters Debunked, Truth or Myth for the True Park Ranger stories. I'm glad you guys are able to stick around. Next Sunday, hopefully next Sunday, we will do episode 5. And to be honest, I'm not sure what I want to do yet. It'll probably be on gargoyles or flying humanoids or something cool like that. And we'll probably rotate back to Dogman or creatures or Bigfoot or something along those lines. Maybe paranormal. Who knows? I may throw a wrench in the gears. You never know. So anyway, guys, I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, morning, whatever time you're listening to this. And yes, enjoy episode 4 and have a wonderful day.